It was past midnight when Jason arrived at the small, dimly lit train station. His phone had died hours ago, and his only option now was to take the last train back home. The weather was cold, and a thick fog had settled over the tracks, casting an eerie silence over the station. He looked at his watch. 12:45 a.m. The last train was due to depart in 15 minutes. Jason had been on a weekend trip to visit some old friends in a neighboring city, and he had completely lost track of time. The evening had stretched longer than expected, and now he found himself stranded at a train station with no way of contacting anyone. The small station was eerily quiet, with only the sound of distant trains passing by. It seemed deserted, almost abandoned. He checked the schedule board, confirming that the last train was indeed on time. There were no other passengers waiting around, which struck him as odd. Normally, late-night trains, though sparse, still had a few passengers. Jason's unease began to grow. He was about to sit down on one of the cold benches when he heard the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. Turning, he saw a woman walking briskly towards the platform. She was tall, with long dark hair that cascaded over her shoulders. She wore a dark coat, and despite the late hour, she seemed completely unbothered by the cold. As she approached, their eyes met briefly. Her gaze was intense, almost penetrating. "Is this the last train?" she asked, her voice smooth and calm. Her accent was strange, but Jason couldn't quite place it. "Yeah, it should be," Jason replied, trying to sound casual, though the woman's presence made him feel slightly uncomfortable. She smiled faintly, nodding. "Good," she murmured before stepping forward and sitting down on a nearby bench. Jason watched her for a moment, then turned back to the tracks. The train was late. He could hear the sound of distant wheels on rails, but the train itself had not yet appeared. The seconds seemed to stretch on endlessly as Jason sat, checking his watch over and over again. It was now 1:05 a.m. The woman had not moved from her seat. He glanced over at her occasionally, but she seemed completely calm, unfazed by the late hour or the desolate station. There was something unsettling about her, but Jason couldn't put his finger on it. Finally, the distant rumble of the train grew louder, and Jason stood up, eager to board and get home. As he approached the platform's edge, the woman stood and walked up beside him. "Are you traveling alone?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with a strange curiosity. "Yeah," Jason answered, trying to ignore the chill running down his spine. "I'm just trying to get home." The train finally appeared, its headlights slicing through the fog like twin eyes. Jason breathed a sigh of relief and stepped aboard. He was about to sit down when the woman followed him inside, her footsteps eerily silent on the train's floor. She chose a seat across from him, and Jason could feel her eyes on him as he settled in. The train started moving slowly, the whistle piercing the quiet night air as they left the station behind. As it gained speed, Jason relaxed a little. He leaned back in his seat, trying to dismiss the unease he had felt earlier. The woman was still staring at him, but now her gaze was more intense, almost predatory. Jason shifted in his seat, feeling suddenly trapped in the small compartment. "Where are you headed?" she asked after a long silence. "Just back home," Jason replied. "It's a long ride." The woman smiled, her lips curving unnaturally as though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm sure it's a long ride, but it's the last one, isn't it?" Jason frowned, unsure what she meant. "The last one?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned her head toward the window, her expression becoming distant, almost vacant. Jason turned his attention to the window as well, watching the mist-covered landscape fly by. The train was speeding faster than it should have been. The trees and buildings blurred, and the lights outside seemed to flicker as if the train was passing through different dimensions. A sense of dread settled over him. Jason looked back at the woman. She was no longer sitting normally, but was leaning forward slightly, her hands clasped together tightly in her lap. "Something's wrong with this train," Jason said, his voice trembling. "This isn't normal." She didn't respond. Her eyes were wide now, and she seemed to be focused on something just beyond the walls of the train. Jason's heart raced. There was something very wrong happening, something he couldn't quite explain. The lights inside the train flickered, and for a moment everything went pitch black. Jason's breath caught in his throat. He reached for his phone, but it was still dead. The sudden darkness felt suffocating, as though the world outside had ceased to exist. A low, unsettling hum filled